Um, I'm a professor at Bar-Ilan University and a research scientist at AI2. I have a research lab of about 20 graduate students, and about half of us are working actively on Hebrew NLP. And my goal in this talk is to sort of make some order in what are contemporary challenges and solutions for Hebrew natural language processing. So as usual, I start with what is the essence of NLP. The way I see it, at least in practical terms, we want to turn unstructured language, text, into structured insights. And this has, of course, a lot of applications. So we can try to take unstructured text, like medical text, and turn them into forms that include information about useful entities, diseases, symptoms, certain bureaucratic tasks like legislation, law, finances. We want to extract certain entities and relations and want to be able to access them or do something smart about them. We may want to populate a knowledge base, for instance, for intelligence purposes, or in case of a global pandemic, for instance, about cases, about spread curves and so on. We have massive of unstructured text. We want to be able to sort of understand them and extract the information that we need. Or we might want to have a machine, a device understanding us and executing what we say. For instance, Siri, Alexa, Cortana, Google now, and your favorite assistant. And so it comes down to this little arrow that we all want, and it's very useful to have. And the question is, how do we implement this magic, this language understanding? And the somewhat a reductionist approach would be, okay, let's just treat it as a machine learning problem. Let's annotate the input texts with the labels that we need and have massive amounts of them and apply some like machine learning technique to predict them. That's, of course, fair to choose this approach. The problem is that in natural language, unlike standard machine learning classifications where you have a small set of values that you want to predict, many times the set of outcomes that you want to predict that are certain structures or certain answers or certain sentences that you want to generate are essentially infinite. And we cannot enumerate them. So what we need is some sort of infrastructure to make certain dimensionality reduction and conceptualize the space. And based on this space of meanings, so to speak, we can then try to predict the kind of outcome that we want. So if I was there, I would ask the audience, what do we have inside this NLP infrastructure? What do you know? What did you hear about? And I imagine I will get this sort of answers, right? So there's BERT, there's Elmo, GPT. Some people maybe work with Spacey, some will work with Stanza, and there are, T5, Transformers, or what have you. So, okay, and we all know they work amazingly well for English, but many of us don't quite know how does this fit together. So how do all these cute Sesame Street models or huge pre-trained models or other models that we happen to download and install in our Python libraries, how do they fit together into this nice pipeline that we want to execute and then obtain these nice applications that I just described? And my goal in this very brief talk is to first discuss how we put together a pipeline for NLP. This is not particular for Hebrew. This is in general. How do we nowadays put together an effective pipeline? And then what are the challenges that we have for Hebrew? And what are the solutions that we might want to develop, and what solutions are already there for you? Okay, so let's start with the NLP pipeline. And I'll sketch it like that. Of course, at the beginning of the pipeline, we have these natural language texts. This can be one sentence in natural language, or it can be a bunch of documents. It can even be a lot of documents. This is the input, typically the input to our task. And this input has to be encoded. What does it mean? We want to take the words, these strings that we get in our text, and present them as vectors. And once upon a time, long time ago, these vectors were based on maybe manual features that we extracted. Later on, we had models like Word2Vec and FastText and Glob to encode words as vectors. And nowadays, we use contextualized models such as BERT and Elmo and GPT and D5 and many more. I will not go into how these are actually trained. I will say something about it later. But the important thing is that these are models that can get a sentence and deliver the sequence of vectors that represent the meaning of the word in context. Another thing that's important to remember is that this is unsupervised training. So we don't need any labeling in order to train something like a BERT model. Okay, so once we encoded our input as a vector, we may want to present certain abstractions over this data. And we usually do it by means of a certain linguistic representation. And this is the point where different applications diverse. Some people want just to know the part of speech tags of the words in order to extract nouns or adjectives or certain modifiers. Some may want to extract the syntactic parse tree in order to know the subject and the object and who did what to whom. Some are interested in named entity recognition or in co-reference relations between these entities. Again, I'm not going to go deep into these architectures today, but these are what if you're working or if you're an NLP practitioner, you're familiar probably with Spacy and Stanza and maybe UDPipe and other pipelines that are there to provide these linguistics representation on top of the text that is given as input. The two things that are important to remember here, first is that this is usually a supervised algorithm. So to be able to predict these structures, we are going to need labeled data with the layer that we're interested in. It can be post-tags or NER or syntactic parse trees or semantic rows. And these are going to be trained to be predicted. And some of these layers might be specific to particular domains. And by the way, for English, there are excellent models doing that in very high accuracy. Okay, moving on down the pipeline towards our downstream applications, there is an important layer, often overlooked, of actually communicating with the knowledge base. And there are two ways to communicate with the knowledge base. One way to communicate is by actually constructing a knowledge base. So exploring the text, extracting, for instance, all entities and relations between them, and then storing them in a database for later use. Or we can be consuming knowledge from a database, which means that what we have is a question or a query or some description of something that we need. The NLP model is used to understand what is being asked, and we then need to mine the answer or the response based on some ready-made, pre-made ontology, symbolic ontology. This process is, by the way, called grounding. This is a very important process of connecting the meanings that are, out there in the words with actual objects that belong to real life. And from here, we can proceed to the application. And what I would argue is that these applications are in abundance in the business world nowadays. They will all need at least one of these components that I presented here, maybe even more than one. And the more red ones are the more critical for the pipelines. As you go sort of rightwards, this becomes more, let's say, can become more domain specific. So this is the pipeline, I assume. And now, assuming we like this, maybe we want to, ask ourselves, okay, why not have this for Hebrew? And I'll start with a certain note that I feel the urge to say that Hebrew is not English. I've been having these discussions on social media. Is Hebrew like English or not? Well, Hebrew is not English for a fact, right? We don't have capitalization. We don't have diacritics. We don't have the same word order patterns. So for instance, in English, we have something like Jane loves John or John loves Jane. This gives us different meanings. In Hebrew, if we permute words, we can get still the same relation. So I'm not going into deep syntactic structures, but the general tendency, linear ordering in the languages are different. And of course, what has already become a textbook material, we also have a very rich morphology, very rich word structure. So I think a lot of the audience already knows that from a single string, we can have multiple analyses, and these analyses impose the composition of the words into what we call morphemes. And each morpheme has its own role, its own part of speech tags, its own set of features. And the word like B'Tselem can be, the organization B'Tselem. It can be talking about an onion, B'Tzal. It can be talking about a shadow, Etzel. It can be talking about a photographer, Tsalam, and so on. And our main problem is that we do not know what is the correct interpretation of a word and the correct decomposition of a word by the time before we know the context in which this appears. So this is the sort of general textbook problem of Hebrew. When we understand sentences, we must, understand the words first, because we build our understanding compositionally, and this is undebatable for any pipeline. But when we understand words, in Hebrew at least, in order to know what segmented words are relevant to our sentences, we actually need to understand the entire context. And the question is what we should do, and some people would say whether we should do something about it at all. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to reflect on this specific question from the point of view of the input encoding component. For two reasons. First, I only have, a very brief time to talk. And second, I think this is kind of unarguable that this is the key component for all the applications. And the challenge is whether we can encode the input in a sufficiently precise way such that it gives us a good entry point for the applications, and how we can make it work accurately and to provide a solid foundation. So I'm going to specifically talk about our project that is called Aleph BERT, and some of you are probably familiar with it. Maybe some of you already heard about it today. And just a few words about BERT. So BERT, as we all know, is a masked language model. And a masked language model is something quite simple, actually. We get sentences. We train this language model with sentences in natural language. We mask some of the sentences, and we try to predict what words were missing. So so if the prediction was good, the score goes high. If the prediction was not so good, the score is low. And by the end of this huge deontic process where we train a massive amount of sentences with massive compute, we get these word vectors. So we can generate for each sentence its words encoding, its embeddings, in such a way that they represent aspects of the meaning of the words, and there's a whole field called Bertology, trying to decipher what exactly is in these vectors. But what we know is that these vectors are very useful for either for linguistic prediction or for downstream application. So the most natural thing for us to do is to basically train it on Hebrew. But then Google have given us the opportunity to use multilingual BERT. Multilingual BERT is actually trained for a number of languages, a huge number of languages. And what multilingual BERT does for English and Hebrew and all the other languages breaks the words into word pieces. Okay, so this is a real case study. This is how BERT breaks the words into word pieces for the sentence Shabbat b'boker yom yafeh. Shin, bat, bet, boker, yom, yud, and po. Here there are sort of two sorts of responses to that. So one response is, okay, I don't care. I mean, this is what BERT does. The vectors will somehow take care of it. And the other one is, actually, I do care about this. I actually think that this is going to be not so good foundation for the application. I'm going to pause and have if I have time for a quick demo. I guess I'll just show it. So,
Reut, you have 2 minutes.
Okay.
We have to finish at 3.
I'll do it very quickly. So, what happens when we use multilingual BERT with this kind of sentence and we want to mask a word like Shabbat, a very simple word, we get kind of odd utterances. Yom b'boker yom yafeh, shana b'boker yom yafeh, b'yom b'boker yom yafeh. So you might think, okay, that's BERT. What can we do? So if I select Aleph BERT, it actually looks much better, right? Shabbat b'boker yom yafeh, shishi b'boker yom yafeh, rishon b'boker yom yafeh, sheva b'boker. This is kind of problem with the bidirectionality, and so on. For the remaining minutes, I will quickly say what how come a bird can give us such a different answer, and assure you that this actually reflects in the downstream applications. So we wrote an article a year ago about how this multilingual BERT doesn't actually work very well for the existing benchmark for Hebrew. And this year we released Aleph BERT, that what it does, and I'm going to say it in like 2 slides, it basically flips the pipeline. Okay, so what we do, we actually aim to not break the word at all. This is somewhat not intuitive, right? We're talking about morphology and how we need to decompose stuff. But we know that BERT doesn't know how to decompose it, so we just give it up altogether. And we do it by enforcing a huge vocabulary for all combinations. And once we get the vectors for the undecomposed, that's a funny word, elements, then we have an architecture to do the segmentation based on all the information in the BERT vector. So let's go back to here. I don't have time to talk about the architecture, but what I can tell you is that this combines char-based and token-based representation. This is trained separately, and what we get is a pre-trained model that supports a pipeline for doing multiple tasks: the segmentation of the words, the part of speech tagging, the NER labeling, so we can identify tags and entities, and moreover, we can use our pipeline to check all the other versions of BERT, right? So you can basically plug in different BERT versions and see if your development goes into the right direction. And we do that, and we actually see that comparing all the different BERT versions that exist for Hebrew, we actually get the best results for all benchmarks that do exist nowadays for Hebrew. And they're not much, and we need more baselines, but we perform better than YAP for morphological and syntactic tagging. We prefer better than NEMO on the database we released a while ago. So about 80% for NER accuracy and disambiguation, and the best result on the sentiment analysis benchmarks that are out there. And what I want to conclude is that, yes, so we can construct an effective pipeline, and we can use useful neural models, methodology, and models for the development of application. But we should still remember that Hebrew is not English, and we should pay particular attention for the peculiarity that we have. We have to set up proper evaluation standards so that we know what kind of items we compare. We should probe into what these vectors actually mean in order to be able to eventually get the results that we want and develop all these beautiful and useful applications and architectures. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and if there is any time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Reut.